Okay, everybody participated in the dream and learned the story of the Sandman. And now we come to chapter 16. Oh, what a mysterious morning. And as Sandy reached the end of his story, everyone awoke from the dream. They blinked their eyes and roused, surprised to find that it was morning. Those who had fallen asleep while floating in the air around Big Root awoke in their usual beds and under their covers. Itchy eye. Grandpa's itchy eye. North was in his customary Cossack bed shirt and sleeping cap. His trusty elfin men were on the floor in a row at the foot of his bed. They snorted awake like a litter of young piglets. Bunnymund was all comfy in his egg-shaped bed, which he always traveled with, his head propped up by half a dozen egg-shaped pillows. He was wearing satin pajamas with matching ear warmers. This huge bunny, matching ear warmers that had small egg-shaped pom-poms dangling from the tip. Bunnymund lifted the egg-shaped patches that covered his eyes and gave his ears a wake-up shake. Ombrick was, of course, roosting in his huge globe surrounded by his owls. They woke in unison, as always, though Ombrick did not hoot as he usually did. Tuthiana found herself perched in a marvelous twig structure that hung like a bell from one of the limbs that formed the top of Big Root's canopy. It was the perch she had back in Punjab High Low. How has it arrived in Santop Closet, she wondered. The children were in the same place they had started the evening, at the top of Big Root, nestled next to Kailash in her gigantic nest. They looked around utterly perplexed. The dream had seemed so real. Yet here they were, feeling rested and ready. But for what exactly? The host of their dream was nowhere to be seen. Nightlight stood up and looked at the spot where Sandman had hovered. There was nothing, not even a grain of sand. Mr. Qwerty peered at his pages. They were filled. The entire dream had been written down, and at the very end was a tiny drawing of Sandman. I love the imagination of this story. Nightlight gazed at the illustrated page. He was unsure what to think about what he saw, but he reached out and touched the sparkling sketch. The drawing was made from a sort of sticky sand. It had been left by Sandman himself. So Nightlight's looking at the page and Mr. Qwerty. He reached out and he touched it, made out of sticky sand. Golden grains clung to Nightlight's fingertips. He looked at them closely. He could feel the magic in them. Then he had a sort of flash of memory of a song from so long ago. Nightlight, bright light, sweet dreams I bestow. Is there a message there, Nightlight? Peter asked. Nightlight closed his eyes and held his sand-covered fingertips to his forehead. The sand told him many, many things. Nightlight rarely, if ever, spoke. Only the direst of circumstances could compel him to use his mesmerizing, otherworldly voice, so it was all the more alarming when he quietly replied, only that he's gone to help Catherine and that none of us should follow. Chapter 17, Nightlight Dawns. The five guardians were in a full frenzy for the rest of the day, or more accurately, Ombrick, North, Bunnymund, Tuthiana debated all morning, while Nightlight remained still and quiet. He watched his friends study grain after grain of Monsnoozy's sand under a never-ending array of magnifying glasses, microscopes, spy glasses, cosmic ray detectors, and even a crystal-clear egg that Bunnymund assured them could pinpoint the precise origin of the sand and its exact age. It did neither. After hours of testing and studying, the only conclusion they came to was that this sand was, well, sand. It obviously had magical properties, but what exactly were those properties and how were they triggered? No one knew. And so they argued on about everything, whether to try to follow Sandman, how to follow him if they ever could agree to follow him, where he might have gone and what to do if they found him. Should they split up and try to find Catherine? Should they call the lunar llamas? Should they try to contact the man in the moon? And most irritatingly, why hadn't Sandman asked them to join him? They studied charts. They consulted clouds. They looked into the past. They tried to see the future. They grumbled and worried and fussed. Though Nightlight remained silent, it was not without purpose. He had not yet told his friends that he could read the sand, which was not unusual. He spoke only if he thought it necessary. He was always curious about the ways of the tall ones, as he called adults. He did not think of them as smart or intelligent. He thought of them in terms of other qualities, those things that made a tall one good. Kindness, bravery, trust, fun. But if they were cruel, lied maliciously, or were mean, then Nightlight viewed them as bad. North, Ombrick, Bunnymund, and Toothiana were Nightlight's favorite tall ones. He understood that they were the most good. And he understood they had knowing, which was his way of calling them wise. Then he thought about Sandman's dream story and the new tall one, Mother Nature. Was Mother Nature good or bad? Good question, isn't it? Now that he knew her story, he was not sure. As a child, she'd been kind and wild and brave like Catherine and like himself. But so much hurt had come to her, so much loss. It had changed her, and it had changed Pitch, her father. Nightlight stared at his friends. They seemed changed too, like they'd lost their knowing and bravery and tallness. Now all they did was talk aloud, as he referred to arguments, and do the nothing. This scared Nightlight. He put his sandy fingertips to his forehead again. The sand. Just having it touch his brow made him feel calm and clear. Suddenly, he felt himself understand his friend's behavior. The sand had given him a bit of the knowing. His friends, they were hurting too. Catherine being gone was hurting them so much that they were scared, just like he was. And he hated feeling scared and hated all this hurt. He hated it so much he couldn't stand it any longer. He thought of the words of Catherine's stories that had washed away when Mr. Qwerty had cried. He could almost hear them in his pocket. Remember, he had gathered up all the words and put them in his pocket when Mr. Qwerty was crying. It was as if Catherine herself was calling out to him. He had to do something. He leaped up and slammed his staff on the floor as hard as he could, over and over, till the room began to shake. The other guardians stopped in mid-argument and looked at him with bewildered awe. Now that he had their attention, he began to dart about the room in his faster-than-light way, herding them toward the center of the room. Hey, Squirt, North Rum, who do you think you are? You can't shut Nightlight kicked the Cossack firmly in the rear, moving him along. He's gone mad, said Bunnymund, just before Nightlight grabbed him by both ears and yanked him into place. Or he's playing some sort of game, mused Ombrick, as Nightlight jerked his beard firmly, that is, Ombrick's beard, and pulled the old wizard along with it. Toothiana began to see what the boy was up to. She moved to the room's center without any coaxing. There they stood as Nightlight had insisted, in a sort of circle, looking at one another, perplexed and curious about what the boy was up to. Nightlight now sat cross-legged on the floor in the center. He held up Mr. Qwerty and turned the magical book's pages slowly. Then, when he found the right spot, he stood and thrust the book close to each of their faces. Those four, those magnificent four, the bravest and most wise of all the tall ones who had ever lived, these guardians of the world's children, stood sheepishly as a boy, admittedly a magical boy, but still a mere boy, showed them what Sandman's sand was capable of doing and how to unlock its magic. Nightlight held his sandy fingertips to his lips and blew. The sand drifted toward them, and as it sprinkled around their eyes and faces for the second time in 24 hours, the four instantly fell asleep. In perfect unison, they teetered some more, then fell backward onto the floor. They were snoring before they landed. Nightlight again pointed to Mr. Qwerty and said to his napping friends, "Catherine's story, her life, her hurts, her. That's what we have to say. Remember your knowing. Be stronger than the scared and the hurt, and dream a way to save our Catherine." Then Nightlight spoke to Mr. Qwerty. "Be writing what just happened on your pages, Mr. Q. That today, Nightlight, the boy guardian, had the knowing of a tall one." That's the most Mr. Qwerty or anyone had ever heard Nightlight say. And though Ombrick, North, Bunnyman, and Tupiana were away in the land of dreams, they could still hear him. They could still hear him. In their sleepy minds, they each were in agreement that what Nightlight had told them was exactly what they needed to hear. Chapter 18. Do not be afraid of the dark. Catherine was surrounded by total darkness. She could see nothing. She couldn't tell if her eyes were open or shut. She tried to blink, but wasn't even sure if she'd succeeded. In such darkness, it was impossible to tell. She then attempted to flash her hands back and forth in front of her eyes, but she realized she couldn't move. Her brain was telling them to move, but they didn't budge. And then she realized that nothing would move. Not her legs, not her toes, not her smile. She tried to cry out, but nothing happened. Strangely enough, she didn't feel afraid yet. Then she began to hear voices, low murmurs of speech, a little louder than whispers. She couldn't make out any words. It was just an unnerving babble, word-like sound. The voices were deep and menacing, mocking, as if amused by her being trapped. It hit her. She was trapped. Where? By what? The voices came closer. She still couldn't grasp what they were saying, but then she recognized a different sound. Crying. It was a girl crying. The other voices were becoming quieter, and she could hear the crying more clearly. Then Catherine became afraid. That was her voice crying. But it was the strangest sensation. The crying was somehow separate from herself, as if behind a wall. Then she heard an actual door open. Light, white with brightness, began to shine in front of her. It was coming from the opening doorway, and she could see the room inside. It was so bright, almost blinding. Then she began to make out a shape sitting on the floor. It was a girl. It was her. She looked old. How can this be? This older Catherine's crying continued. It sounded like a young woman's. Her clothes were faded and nearly rags. Why? And in her hands was Mr. Qwerty. Good. She saw herself start to turn the pages one by one from the beginning. This Catherine was reading the book very intently, but as she finished a page, a dark hand reached out and tore the pages from the book. She glimpsed her entire history as it was taken away. There was one set of drawings that she could clearly make out. The images she had made for North for his city of the future. She watched her older self close the book and close her eyes. She was going to sleep. She looked unspeakably sad. Tears escaped from her closed eyes. Then the sounds of murmuring voices grew louder. They came closer to Catherine and closer till it seemed as if they were inches from her, just next to her ears. They mumbled on and on, then began to laugh. She could feel breath against her ears and cheeks, but she couldn't see. Who was it? What was this awful language? The door allowing the light in, began to slowly close. The bright glow of that other room, the only light, began to vanish. But then she realized it wasn't a door closing, but Pitch himself blocking out the light. He held the pages of her book in his one good hand. He looked at them gleefully and began to laugh. This is like a nightmare, Catherine thought, and her fear deepened. This is a nightmare, she realized. Her fear swelled then because she knew. She could feel it. She was caught in a nightmare from which she could not awaken. Chapter 19. Nicholas St. North didn't realize he was asleep on the floor of Ombrick's library in Bigford. The dream sand had felled him in mid-thought, and it was such an odd thought. He was thinking of Nightlight and what in the world the boy was doing, but at the same time he had been briefly distracted by Bunnymun's ears. One of them was definitely longer than the other by about 3/4 of an inch, and then, bam, he was asleep. And while he could still hear Nightlight talking, it was as if the boy were 1,000 miles away, something about Catherine, about saving her. So that's where his mind began to wander as he dreamed, to Catherine. He saw bits and pieces of his time with her, how she had tended his wounds when he was so near death after his fight with Pitch and Bear, how she had brought him out of his bitter, lonely shell, how the two of them had saved each other time and again. Then he dreamed of Nightlight, of the enchanted friendship between Catherine and the spectral boy. He was worried, though. Catherine was growing up. But could the same be said of Nightlight? He was an otherworldly creature who never changed. He never grew taller or thinner or fatter. Even his hair didn't grow. He'd been a young boy for who knows how long. This was troubling, and then more so as North's dream began to darken. He saw Catherine becoming old and growing. Then Nightlight seemed to vanish, to fade away into nothing, and as he did, Catherine's eyes closed. Darkness folded around her like a shroud that became Pitch's cape. Then Pitch's face appeared atop the cloak and began to spin faster and faster, making a dreadful sound, a most awful sound, a squealing, screeching, laughing sound. North felt terrified. He felt far away. He felt helpless. Then, like a bright bolt, everything changed. Now Catherine was standing over him. Her face was huge. This seemed familiar. It was. It was when North had been turned into a toy by Pitch during the battle with the Emelian. Catherine had picked him up, held and protected his tiny paralyzed body and dreamed a dream that had saved him. The dream of his future. The dream had been so glorious, so beautiful. He would build a great city of snow and ice, and it would be filled with magic and good works. It would be like Santa Claus, but on a grand, magnificent scale. In bright, brief flashes, he saw Catherine's dreams for him more clearly than he ever had before. He saw it as a reality of what could be. There was a great tower, a pole-like spire that rose up in the center of this city, and from this pole, lights would shine out into the world. And now he could clearly hear Catherine's voice urging him to build this place. It will destroy Pitch. It will save me. Then she said the words they all use, the most powerful words in all of magic. I believe, believe. Believe indeed, North thought in the wakeful part of his sleeping mind. Catherine was sending him a message from wherever she was being held. He just knew it. It was as strong as any feeling he had ever had. Nightlight had told him to find a way to save Catherine, but he hadn't had to find it. It was being sent to him. By the bond of their friendship, Catherine was telling him how to save. He fought now to awaken, but that dratted dream sand was so very powerful. Chapter 20. Dreams and relics and powers unsuspected. I believe. Dream sand was indeed powerful, but when the guardians share an identical dream, the power of their struggle to wake up was even stronger. They had all felt as if Catherine was reaching out to them by sending this dream. So they roused themselves, shaking the sleep from their minds and rising with a cry, a unanimous call to action. This dream must be made real for Catherine's sake and for the good of all, proclaimed Ombrick. He felt re-energized. He felt like the Ombrick of old. He quickly thought through all the possibilities and circumstances. He nodded to himself as he pondered. First, this Sandman fellow had gone to help Catherine and insisted they would not follow. Now they had their first message from her since she'd been abducted. Holmbrick nodded once more. Sandman must be making progress, and so the choice was obvious. The city of North's future must be built. Holmbrick wasn't yet sure why or how, but he knew it would somehow be Catherine's salvation. He looked up to see his fellow guardians all nodding along with him, agreeing with the very same thoughts they themselves were having. They all knew what had to be done. It was bold, it was ambitious, it was unlike anything they had ever attempted. A new city had to be built, and an old one changed. Toothiana flew to the knothole window of Big Root. No time can be lost, she called down to the whole village. Then she sent out her bright musical call, singing all the way to Punjab High-Low. The magic elephant must come and help, she added. She called out once more, cocked her head as if listening to the wind, and then, with one flap of her wings, she filled the air around the village with legions of her tiny, flying warrior helpers. Bunnyman tilted one ear appraisingly, then tapped his foot 4 times on the floor. In seconds, hundreds of warrior eggs popped up forth from fresh tunnels surrounding the outer edge of the thick forest around Big Root. Tiny berries, warrior eggs. They scurried toward Ombrick's home on stick-like legs. The creatures of the air will need help from those of the earth, the rabbit man explained wryly. Ombrick took this all in approvingly. He held his staff aloft. Guardians, he boomed out. Place your relics together, my friends. This mission will require all of our powers. His owls began to hoot madly as if they could sense that something unprecedented was about to occur. Bunnyman held his staff against Ombrick's, and the jeweled egg on its tip began to glow. Toothiana took out her ruby box and joined it to the staff's. The glow shifted from pale to red, growing ever brighter, glistening. Then they all looked to Nightlight and North. Nightlight motioned for North to go next. The valiant buccaneer kept his head down. He seemed almost bashful. His voice was barely a whisper when he said, "You are indeed the truest of friends." He paused for a moment, overcome. At last, he added, that you would help me, that you would help make true this dream given to me. My dear North, Bunnyman interrupted. It is, I believe, a dream we share. The Puka's words were true. It was by now a dream that belonged to them all. North grabbed his sword and swept its crescent moon tip up to the other relics. The light of North's blade was almost too bright to look into. There was a moment's hesitation. Ombrig said what each of them had suddenly realized. Will this work without the final relics? There were 5 relics from the Golden Age that Tsar Lunar had told them was necessary to defeat Pitch, and they had only 3. Bunnymun's ears suddenly began twitching wildly in opposite directions. Then, just as suddenly, they stopped. Nightlight, he yelled, your staff. Its power, combined with the power of Ombrig's staff, might be enough if my calculations are correct. The others agreed and urged Nightlight closer, but Nightlight resisted. He knew they were wrong, yet they needed convincing. So he walked up to them and raised his staff up to the other relics. Its diamond tip did indeed begin to glow. The moonbeam that lived inside, his moonbeam, sent by the man in the moon himself, flickered and shined brighter than ever. It was not what was needed. Nightlight could feel the worry and disappointment of his friends as their collective light failed to grow brighter, despite the addition of Nightlight's staff. It's still not powerful enough, Ombrig said in a strained voice. Nightlight felt frustrated. His fellow guardians were all so knowing, but sometimes they failed to see the most obvious things or forgot to look. Again, only Nightlight's childish mind could understand the truth. But if Sandman had been brought to them by Tsar Luna, then surely he had brought with him something invaluable to the Guardians. If Sandman was from the Golden Age, then so was his sand. Nightlight took up a few grains of Sandman's sand and blew it into the light of the relics. A flash as bright as a dozen suns filled the room instantaneously. At that moment, Catherine's dream for North began its journey from the dimension of dreams to the realm of the real. In the same moment, every other tree in the forest began to uproot itself. Every other creature from Santoff Claus began to be affected by the magic that was washing through the village. They began to feel that something amazing was about to happen to them. Half of this wondrous place would make the journey. The other half would stay and hold. Friends, old and new, would be separated for the good of all. Chapter 21, Another Nightmare. Catherine was running. She was in a forest. It was night. There was a bright moon, which made seeing easier, but also made the shadows even denser and darker in contrast. There was no wind at all. The air lay thick and heavy all around her. There were no insects singing or the usual low commotion of a forest night, just an unnerving quiet. The only sound was her footsteps on the grass and the sound of the thing that was pursuing her. It seemed as if she had been running for days. Even though she was going as fast as she could, her feet were as heavy as lead. She could barely raise them. She heard the thing coming behind her. Its movements were smooth and agile. It was coming closer and quickly. She had to hurry. Why were her feet so leaden? She seemed to be slower with each step. She glimpsed the thing, but only for a few fractured instants as it moved from leafy shadows into the moonlight and back into shadow. Light, shadow, light, shadow, a horrible flickering. Never long enough to see the thing clearly. It was a squirming, lumpy mass as big as a bear, but not like a bear at all, not like anything she could name. It was coiled and knotted, like a tangle of giant snakes, but there was an arm too. A man's arm, Pitcher's arm, coming from the thing's center, clawing at the ground and pulling it forward. long, snaky tails, each as thick as a small tree trunk, twisted out from the main mass, helping the arm move its bulk over rocks and roots with disturbing ease. Catherine was desperate to get away from the thing. She had to go faster, but her feet grew heavier still. Stepping over tree roots grew harder, then almost impossible. The thing was getting nearer, closer. Ahead was a small clearing where the ground was level. Catherine willed herself to reach it. Maybe she could run faster from there. She staggered toward it. The sound of clawing behind her, a lean whisper of slithering, was getting closer. Now she didn't dare look back. She reached the clearing. Her first dozen steps were a victory. Swift and strong, she was gaining speed. Her feet were light now. She was running. She could feel the strength surging through her legs as they quickened their pace. She felt revitalized, as if she could run like this forever. Fists tight, she pumped her arms up and down in perfect rhythm with her stride. Up ahead was a huge tree. It looked familiar. It was Big Root. Faster, faster. If she could just make it to the door, she knew she'd be safe. She tried to call out. Someone would hear her, help her. Night light, she gasped, but she was too winded. She didn't dare slow down. The thing was right behind her. It would catch up. She tried again. Night light, help. But her voice was barely a gasp. Faster, faster, faster. Then her foot came down onto ground that was like mud, softer even. Her legs sank past her knee. Her next desperate step went even deeper. She tried to push herself forward, but it was no use. She was sinking. She could hear the thing hurrying behind her. She was too afraid to look. She was sinking quickly. She struggled to free herself from the sucking mud, looking yearningly at Big Root all the while. The tree began to pull away from her. How could that be? The distance between them, the ground itself, began to pull up into the air. Were her friends leaving her? The thing. She didn't dare turn around, but she knew it was only steps away as it covered the last bit of distance between them. She heard it reach the mud. It couldn't be more than 10 feet away. 5. She closed her eyes. It did no good. She could still see the thing in her mind. Then she felt the hand of it on her collar. She tried to scream, but nothing came out, not even a whimper. If her friends could only hear her, they would come. They always. Why couldn't they hear her? Chapter 22. At last, a kind wind. Sanderson Man Snoozy had been extremely busy. He had scoured the entire planet searching for Catherine with no success. He had not searched in any conventional manner. He did not prowl about, actually looking with his eyes to find her. Nor did he ask people or creatures if they had seen her or noticed anything unusual that might lead him to her. He could have asked any passing cloud about her. He had the ability to communicate to clouds and to other natural phenomena, such as wind and rainbows, but he knew they would not tell him a thing. He'd come to realize they were under the influence of EmilyJane. Of course, they did not know her by that name. They only knew her as Mother Nature. In fact, he was sure they were watching him and reporting to her his every move. He was not entirely surprised by this. The many tragedies of Mother Nature's previous life had turned her into a solitary and mistrustful being. It wasn't unexpected that she had watchers everywhere. Still, he hoped that if she was being informed of his whereabouts, their old friendship would perhaps spur her to contact him and hopefully help. But so far, no such gesture had come. This did not surprise him either. This did not surprise him either. For even as a girl, she didn't often reach out to others. There were some creatures that were willing to tell him what they knew of how EmilyJane became this nature matriarch. Sea creatures were more sympathetic to his mission, especially seashells and mermaids. They had become familiar with man Snoozy in his island during his long sleep, and had watched over him. They saw what had happened when his island had first formed. They'd seen the explosion of his star and the girl who had been freed by its destruction. They too did not know her as EmilyJane. To them, she had no name at all. But they saw the power she had over wind and clouds and natural phenomena. They saw her use the magic she had learned from Typhon, but she remained a mysterious force to them, always moving, never resting, calm one day, stormy the next. Mother Nature. Well, there's little creatures from the sea. And to refresh our memory, man Snoozy, huh? Mother Nature, calm one day, stormy the next. So Sandy searched for Catherine the best way he knew how, by listening for her dreams. Nearly every living thing has dreams: dogs, frogs, gazelles, centipedes, guppies, and certain plants, such as dandelions and weeping willows. Sandman could hear the dreams of every creature and every person on earth. He was certain he had not heard Catherine's. The dreams of the guardians were distinct from any other dreams he had ever encountered. Not only were their dreams extraordinarily vivid, they had a lifelike clarity, unlike any others, but he could also tell that the guardians had the ability to dream share their minds. Their minds could bond while dreaming. But in Catherine's case, that bond had been damaged and now perhaps destroyed. Even creatures as powerful and mysterious as Pitch or Mother Nature had dreams, though Sandy had no clue what those were like. They had both successfully blocked his efforts to read them, but he could still feel the distant presence of their dreams, so he knew they were somewhere. He also knew North and the others had received a dream from Catherine while he had been searching for her. He had felt their dreams while they experienced this message from Catherine, but he had not felt this dream. He had felt their dreams while they experienced this message from Catherine, but he had not felt the dream. How could that have been? He was suspicious of Catherine's dream, as though it seemed to be of good intent. How had she sent it? Or had she sent it? For with Catherine, she could feel nothing. Only one thing could stop a person from dreaming. And this was what worried Sanderson Man Snoozy as he sat drifting over the earth on his cloud of dream sand. He was trying to avoid asking the question he most dreaded. The time had come. Was Catherine no longer alive? The thought was so dark and sad, though he had not met this girl. He had heard her dreams many times during his great sleep, but he knew how extraordinary she was. Could Pitch have been so evil as to end her? Sandy felt sadness welled up inside him, and his cloud of dream sand began to drizzle. It was a light rain made of drops of pure sorrow. That poor girl, he thought, was alone and lost as EmilyJane, and now perhaps lost forever. Dense, dark clouds began to form spontaneously and billow toward him. They were gigantic and storm-like, but they held no wind or thunder. Once Sandman was fully encircled by the storm, he heard a familiar voice boom around him. It came from the cloud. I can stand anyone's tears but yours. It was EmilyJane Pitchener, now Queen Mother of Nature. I can stand anyone's tears but yours, is the voice he heard. Besides, I control the rain here. Hold on, I'll send you to the girl. She will take me to the girl, Man Snoozy thought, as relief flooded to even the tiniest grain of sand in his being. Catherine must be alive. He looked up into the cloud nearest to him as it began swirling ever more tightly, narrowing into a sort of tunnel. For the briefest moment, he saw EmilyJane standing at the opening. Let me read this again. He looked up into the cloud nearest to him as it began swirling ever more tightly, narrowing into a sort of tunnel. For the briefest moment, he saw EmilyJane standing at the opening. Her majestic robes whirled around her, and it seemed as though they were what powered the clouds. He felt a deep satisfaction at seeing her at last. She had grown up without his realizing it. Even more gratifying was knowing that his time with her had left some echo of kindness in her soul. He nodded gravely to her, and she returned the nod. Old friends sometimes need no words to understand each other. Then her winds guided him swiftly up and away towards Catherine. Chapter 23. Dream that becomes real. The combined power of the three relics with the dream sand was extraordinary. Their collective energy was nearly nuclear, but smooth and efficient rather than destructive. Quadrillion molecules had been released, all with the intent of instantaneously transporting many of the vast resources of Santov Claus into a spot nearly halfway around the planet without any damage or upset. Trees from the enchanted forest, books from Ombrick's library, the bear, North's elves, dozens of forest creatures of every species, including a small herd of the mighty reindeer, Mr. QWERTY, the robot genie, guardians and their helpers, all found themselves in a wondrous, frozen landscape. But there was even more. From the lunar lamidary came dozens of yetis, the clock that could enable time travel, the magnificent flying tower, accompanied by a note from the llamas. The note read, "May come in handy, or perhaps useful, or perhaps necessary, or even essential, or not, but perhaps." Everything arrived and landed at its final destination according to a precise design that had been formulated in North's imagination. North was thunderstruck. He had been working on plans for this new city to the north, as he called it, ever since Catherine first sent him his dream of the future. But he'd done so alone during moments of quiet. He'd shown his fellow guardians a paper model of the city, but that had been a simplistic thing, barely more than a childlike sketch. This was as if he'd witnessed part of his imagination unfold into reality. Another reality was that where they had landed was cold, very cold. They huddled together in a large group, looking around at the icy landscape that surrounded them. They were on a snow-covered peak, miles and miles of snow and glaciers spread before them in every direction. I wonder where they are. Could it be North Pole? The towering cedar and pine trees from the enchanted forest that had uprooted themselves only a short time ago in Santov Clausen had been magically replanted around the base of the peak, forming a wall around the city to be. So they were on a snow-covered peak. Miles and miles of snow and glaciers spread out. And then the forest pants itself around. Ombrick stroked his beard, cleared his throat, and looked at North inquisitively. His former apprentice had become a wizard of rather astounding accomplishments. And though the old wizard might never admit it aloud in some ways, North was now more than Ombrick's equal. "Nicely done, my boy," he said. "Now exactly where are we?" North could tell that his old teacher was much impressed. In the past, he'd have gloated and said something to vex the old man, but he knew this wasn't the time for that. They had the most important mission of their lives ahead of them, and time was short. North swept his arms wide as though to include everyone in his response. "We are at the magnetic pole of the northern hemisphere," he called out loud enough for all to hear. "The first city of the new golden age will be here." "The North Pole," Bunnyman murmured thoughtfully. "I remember when I first magnetized it. Good choice." Toothiana, her troops, the warrior eggs, the yetis, the reindeer, and everyone seemed to agree. Nightlight just smiled. He was glad to have helped, but had plans of his own. Chapter 24, something perhaps worse. EmilyJane and Sandman arrived on their clouds at the entrance of a small cave outside the town of Tanglewood in the northeast part of a country called America. The surrounding forests were thick with craggy pine and hemlock, and a great many bats flittered through the trees. And in and out of the mouth of the cave, an old, well-worn Indian trail led to the cave, and if Nightlight had been with them, he'd have remembered this dark and mournful place as the very spot where Pitch had been frozen for centuries, pinned by Nightlight's diamond dagger embedded into his heart. EmilyJane enshrouded both herself and Sandman within dense cloud cover so as not to be seen, then said to her old friend, "This is as far as I will go. He is, after all, my father, for good or ill." Sandy nodded again. He never spoke except through dreams or thoughts, but he understood her reasoning. So he was surprised when she said more, giving voice to her fears. "He promised me he would not make this girl his princess," she told him. "But he did something perhaps worse." Sandy frowned. "You will see for yourself," she said. Knowing Sandy so well, she knew his question without the ask. She took his hand just for an instant. "Be careful. Be careful. Father is past saving. He is now savage through and through. Father is past saving. He is now savage through and through." Then she turned away hurriedly, her robe swirling round. Within seconds, her cloud had billowed away into the night sky, taking her with her. Sanderson, man Snoozy, had faced countless dangers in his long and varied life, but this time he felt a fear that was darker than the depths of space. One more chapter. Chapter 20. A place of endless possibilities. And he's the cave. Thousands of miles away, at the North Pole, things were progressing with astounding speed and ease. A small but fantastic city was taking shape. The varied talents of the Guardians and their allies were on full display. The strength of the Yeti, Bear, and the robot Genie had been put to great use in cutting and forming the ice and wood that would make up many of the city's fanciful structures. Toothiana and her tooth fairy zipped in and out of the towers and outer buildings, carving intricately ornate windows and doors through the solid ice walls. Bunnyman was busy everywhere, from digging out massive blocks of ice to burrowing a network of elaborate tunnels that would connect every building in the city to the rest of the world. To the rest of the world. It was a blur of city-creating activity. Ombrick and North focused most specifically on the great central tower that would officially mark North City. The centerpiece for this was the original flying tower of the lunar lapidary, and once they had it in place, Once they had it in place, a tricky maneuver that at first seemed to defy the laws of gravity. They started in on building an extension to that older structure. They made it taller, bigger, and even more grand. North had it all planned out. This tower would become a beacon to the world. It would generate a multicolored shimmering of light that could reach almost to the heavens and that he had already named the Northern Lights. These lights would be capable of sending forth all sorts of messages to the Guardians and their allies, no matter where on Earth they might be. So that's what the Northern Lights are doing, huh? Additionally, the tower's precise placement would enable North to see any part of the planet beyond. Best of all, it could also fly. Its transportive power was unlike any that had ever been since the old Golden Age. It could break past the Earth's atmosphere and fly out into the cosmos. Think of it, old man, North said to Ombrick excitedly. We'll be able to visit the moon, meet Tsar Lunar himself in person. Ombrick was putting the finishing touches on the new library. All his knowledge, all his wisdom, he was now passing on to this most amazing young man, one whose start had seemed most dubious. The thought made Ombrick feel both satisfied and perhaps a little sad. His pupil was now the master. But that's how it should be. He put his hand on North's shoulder. The moon, he said quietly. After we save Catherine, we'll go meet the man in the moon together. They looked up into the sky. The moon was just over the horizon. From where they stood, the possibilities were endless. Last chapters next time.